Ooh, I am not here to talk about Section 201. Great. Thanks so much for joining us here this afternoon. I'll be talking about energy storage's inflection. Is it here? Are we already seeing energy storage at a point where it can compete with other traditional and non-traditional generation assets? Or are we still in the very sort of early stages of that hockey stick where we are still at the base of that hockey stick? So hopefully we'll get to answer that question or give you some data points to think and make a decision for yourself whether or not we are at that inflection point. So this is the chart where we show the storage deployments by quarter, grid-tied storage deployments by quarter over the past 3+ years. And as you can see, for the most part, the trend line has been more ups and downs, except in Q4 2016 and Q1 2017. So for those of you who haven't been following the Alice Canyon-related gas facility shutdown back in 2016, those two skyscrapers, if you may, are a direct result of the procurement that California PUC asked its IOUs, SCE and SDG&E to undertake. And a result of that was about 80 plus megawatts and 4-hour duration systems were deployed in Q4 2016 and Q1 2017. An interesting sort of anecdote there is those systems were the procurement actually started in middle of 2016, and in a matter of 6 to 9 months, those systems went all the way from conception, getting regulatory approval from the PUC, getting California ISO's interconnection approval process done, of course procuring the batteries and inverters and all other balance of plants that are needed to build those facilities. And on 31st December, half of those facilities were online, and end of January, the other half was online as well. So an interesting sort of case study to prove the role of storage as a grid participant that can come online as quickly as 6 months. Of course, the right ingredients are needed. And hopefully, we won't have an emergency like the Alice Canyon again, but the situation did provide a useful case study for storage. And then we step back, once the gray swan or the black swan event of Alice Canyon facility shutdown was done, we are back to our usual sort of trend of continuous but slow growth in energy storage in Q1 and Q2 2017. A couple of interesting data points to look at that, of course, which I'm not sure are visible from back there. But although the market grew 6% year over year from Q2 of 2016, it went down by about 80% compared to Q1 2017. However, both the two behind-the-meter segments, the residential as well as the non-residential segments, both had enjoyed their best quarter in this in the whole sort of history of 18 quarters or so that we've been tracking. So that's an interesting data point to keep in mind. So what's causing what are we seeing, or what markets are driving this growth in both behind-the-meter segments as well as the utility scale? California, of course, is the leader when it comes to energy storage, and although the residential space is fairly fragmented, but California and Hawaii continue to sort of go neck to neck pretty much any given quarter, and that's sort of evident by the chart here that roughly little over half of all residential deployments are so far have occurred in California and Hawaii, and then there are other states that contribute to the remaining 48%. Of course, the states that dominate that other half are states in Northeast, where we lose power not that frequently, but at least once a year. We were without power for 4 days last week, so of course, battery or backup generators are necessary in certain parts of Northeast. As well as Southeast states as well, wherever there is a likelihood of weather-related outages, there is a demand for backup power residential-based batteries. The non-residential segment has been dominated by what is called as the demand charge management application, where customers deploy energy storage systems to shave off their peak demand in order to get some electricity bill savings. And again, California, for no surprises here, is the dominant market. Almost 90%, 85% of all behind-the-meter non-residential deployments are occurring in the state of California. There are a couple of reasons for that. One being that California, of course, has one of the highest retail electricity rates, but also the fact that a lot of these deployments are supported by California's self-generation incentive program, which is a fairly generous incentive program that provides upfront incentives for behind-the-meter customers to deploy energy storage, along with a few other clean technologies. And lastly, on the utility scale, again, the same or similar trend that California happens to be the leader, and little under half or 44% of all utility scale or front-of-the-meter storage deployments have occurred in California through the end of first half of 2017. So before we go, I guess we've talked about where we are at today. Before we sort of think about, are we at the inflection point, let's talk through some of the drivers that could lead us to that inflection point. And I'll be talking about three key drivers and potentially and talking about an example or two on each one of those. One of the key drivers from the actual system needs side, we've been talking about this all day in the morning as well as some of the sessions this afternoon about peak capacity needs, reliability needs, and storage can and has at least started to find some sort of application for peak capacity and resource planning needs that utilities as well as system operators have. So I call this a long storage game because eventually we anticipate that a lot of the storage deployments would fall under this category or this kind of application where storage is being brought in to either provide capacity needs or in certain cases even participate as a transmission or distribution deferral asset, thereby allowing utilities to plan out their grid sort of expansion or grid upgrades in a more cost-effective manner. So Tucson Electric Power signed a contract with NextEra about 6 months ago for what was then called, and probably still is, the lowest cost solar plus storage PPA. It was a 4.5 cents PPA contract for 100 megawatts of solar tied with 30 megawatts and 120 megawatt hours of storage. In other words, a 100 megawatt solar PV facility with a roughly 30% storage attached to it. Of course, the reason for Tucson Electric Power to go that route instead of just signing a regular solar PPA contract is this is the solar profile for the state of Arizona. Each curve is a month, and these are average numbers, of course, and the x-axis is hours 1 through 24. Most of the solar output, of course, falls outside the peak hour needs for Tucson Electric Power's jurisdiction. And although, again, it does provide cheap electricity or 3 cents per kilowatt hour electricity to Tucson Electric Power for 20-year period, most of that electricity would have to be consumed without storage during those hours. And of course, now if you think about how does this single facility fit along with the rest of the portfolio that TEP has, there's an argument to be made that some of that power if it could be shifted, would have higher value, and that leads us to the adding storage to that project. Although this is sort of a rough output of what a solar plus storage system could look like, but as you can imagine, that bulk of the afternoon peak can be pushed towards afternoon periods or evening periods. Now, keep in mind the system was designed to be 100 megawatts of solar with 30 megawatts of storage. If the storage component increases, the cost would go up, of course, but there would be a way to switch or shift a bigger portion of the afternoon peak during evening hours. So I know the news gained got a lot of traction, and it was sort of called again the historically low price PPA contract. To get to that 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour or $45 per megawatt hour LCOE, you do have to come up with some very creative numbers. And we tried to do that, of course, in an outside-in approach towards looking at what such a contract would have to look like from a developer standpoint to actually make money, right? So we had to literally relax all possible assumptions that are tied to the storage portion, coming up with as I would like to call it, laugh test storage cost. Storage cost of about $215 per kilowatt hour. Anyone in the room who is in the storage industry would probably know that these numbers are not achievable today or in the next year or two. However, if we try to sort of get more creative and think about what other leverages NextEra may have to actually make this deal work, you could think about ways in which there could be a post-PPA residual value for that project, either in form of an extended PPA contract or potentially participating in an ISO market, assuming by then the energy imbalance market would of course be active in Arizona. But the point there being that if we were to assign a certain amount of residual value, let's say it's a penny and a half per kilowatt hour, 20 years down the road, factoring inflation and everything, probably is fairly reasonable assumption there. Then we can be slightly more conservative when it comes to storage costs of about $330 per kilowatt hour, which are achievable in the next year and a half or two. This project has a COD of 2019. The other assumptions that we started to sort of play around with is, what if we increase that residual value to 2.5 cents instead of a cent and a half, and that can also get us to that number. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is the cost of capital here is fairly cheap. I know we had some conversations earlier this morning where cost of capital assumptions for a 20-year project can be around 6.5%. And lastly, you could argue that there is a capacity value to that storage asset in addition to the energy value that it can provide to Sun Electric Power. And if you were to, let's say, assign a $46 per kilowatt hour per year capacity value, again, these are just numbers thrown into a spreadsheet, and spreadsheets can give fabulous results if you have the right inputs. You get to a point where the solar plus storage asset can be in the money. The point, of course, here being that we are already seeing contract structures or deals being signed with solar plus storage PPAs, which again goes back to my earlier comment that an important driver would be using storage for peak capacity or local capacity needs. The second driver is, of course, cost reductions. We played with some numbers earlier, but the point is that are we going to get to those cost numbers at all, right? So storage costs have come down pretty drastically in the last 3+ years, both, of course, for the batteries, but also for a lot of the balance of plant components. So the question worth asking is, are we at a point where the technology is evolving at a faster pace than the market itself? So before we get to and even try to answer that question, let's quickly see what the numbers could look like 5 years down the road. So today, the bars that you see are lithium-ion battery pack prices, and the line is the balance of plant price. So for a 4-hour system, roughly in 2017, we are at about $240 per kilowatt hour for battery pack prices, and roughly $500 per kilowatt for a BOS, for all the BOS components, which for a 4-hour system gets you to about $1,500 per kilowatt or $375 per kilowatt hour for a 4-hour system, all in. Keep that number in mind. We'll come back to that later. The question, of course, worth asking is, if we continue on the cost trajectory that we currently are modeling, we could get to as low as, or we could get to as much as, by 2022, $150 per kilowatt hour for battery packs, and BOS prices of $325 per kilowatt. Now, again, if some of you who may be privy to some of the battery contracts or storage contracts with some of the larger technology vendors, These cost numbers are fairly within reach. I think these are fair. It's fair to say that these numbers can be achieved given today's pace of manufacturing expansion, technology innovation, and of course, I sort of race to the bottom approach that some of the vendors have taken. But what that also means is if this is an achievable goal, think about what could happen if the price declines were even more aggressive. And we've seen, like, if you look at solar PV as a case study again, we've always underestimated the potential of cost declines on the solar PV side. To a certain extent, the same has happened in the storage industry as well in the last 4 years. But if you were to sort of expand that to the next 5 years down the road, we could get to a point where a battery pack could be right around $100 per kilowatt hour. A BOS cost would come down to under $300 per kilowatt, which could get to system costs by 2022 of as low as $700 per kilowatt, or if you translate that into dollars per kilowatt hour, for a 4-hour system, they could be as low as a little under $200 per kilowatt hour. Again, keep that number in mind, the under $200 per kilowatt hour. So why are we talking about all this? Because this has serious implications on a lot of the resource planning and capacity decisions that are being made by utilities as well as system operators. For those of you who've been following the recent case of the Puente power plant alternative application, California ISO and CPUC had been working to essentially look at alternatives for the Puente power plant, and the investment for the original plant was marked at around $300 million, and California ISO used estimates for storage of $485 per kilowatt hour. This number is important because I think I showed a few minutes back that we are already at a point where for a 4-hour system prices are lower than that number. And this is for a project that's going to come online a few years down the road. So of course, if you assume a higher than sort of the correct value or the right price estimate for storage system prices, the alternative may not look as attractive. But if you were to think about, let's see what the prices need to be to actually compete with the peaker plant prices or peaker plant investment cost, we can get to a peaker plant competitive price to the peaker plant if you were to assume about $175 per kilowatt hour storage system price, which again, as I showed a couple of minutes back, is an aggressive scenario, but can be achieved a few years down the road, along with, of course, assumptions for solar as well. The point here being, there's a difference of about 3x between what was included as an estimate assumption by California ISO versus what the industry can deliver in the next 4 to 5 years. The point, of course, here being that apart from looking at the need for storage for peaker plant replacement or capacity needs, it's also important to make sure that we are talking the right language with the ISOs and RTOs as well as the PUCs that we're trying to work with. The third driver is more on the softer side. We've seen a huge amount of interest by both strategic investors as well as your plain vanilla traditional investors into storage in the recent months. This has been, of course, we can track. We've been tracking both actual investments in form of project financing, but also the recent spur of consolidation and acquisitions of storage technology companies. If we go back to as early as 2016, through up to a few months ago, there have been a large number of acquisitions of storage vendors as well as downstream storage players. A lot of them, in fact, have been by European utilities and European companies. Some of them have been by some US-based companies as well. But the point again being is as soon as we get bigger players like NL and Total to enter the storage market and be more serious about it, some of those earlier assumptions on cost of capital needs, the ability to bring more gigafactories online, we are talking about a completely different ballgame here. So again, to recap, 3 key drivers that we believe can get us to that inflection point potentially are changes or the role of storage in capacity-based applications, both for generation capacity as well as for some transmission distribution deferral. Second being cost declines, which are being aided by manufacturing capacities coming online. And lastly, changes to the makeup of the industry with more bigger players coming in, as a result of which the games just become more serious now. So of course we come back to the same question: are we at an inflection point? The answer, the short answer or TLDR, is that second-tier markets, state markets especially, are gaining steam. But if you're looking at purely from a power markets lens, outside of California ISO, there are more questions and there's more uncertainty today than answers. Of course, the FERC NOPR, which again, this is the storage NOPR, not the DOE NOPR, to keep that distinction in mind, which of course we did talk about with Chairman Bay earlier this morning, was this NOPR was released end of last year or end of November, in November 16. And the NOPR was designed, or at least structured in a way, to do 3 things for storage and DERs. One is it's designed, or at least it expects, that the ISOs and RTOs will ensure that storage can participate and is eligible to participate in all 3 markets: energy, capacity, as well as ancillary services, not just one or the other. Second being that, keeping in mind that storage has some unique physical and operating characteristics, such as it's a limited energy resource, right? Once you're out of state of charge, once your state of charge is 0, you cannot push more energy out. You have to allow storage to charge back. But on the flip side, it's also a resource that can act both ways, as a generation asset while discharging, or as a load asset while charging, right? And do so with almost instantaneous response time. So those are some of the characteristics that storage can provide, which are fairly unique to it. And FERC has asked through that NOPR that the ISOs and RTOs have to factor those characteristics into their business manuals, as well as operating sort of parameters. And lastly, of course, is to reduce the minimum size for participation to not exceed 100 kilowatts. Today, the minimum size requirements are all over the place by ISO, and even within each ISO, all over the place based off of what service these assets are providing. In some instances, storage needs to be or any asset needs to be at least 5 megawatts to participate in a certain market, and can be 1 megawatt to participate in a different market in the same ISO, right? So the goal here is to get some level of consistency across ISOs and applications. And of course, Chairman Chatterjee recently released a statement saying that, I'm sort of paraphrasing here or quoting selected pieces from his statement, but essentially saying that he was personally committed to addressing the issues and moving forward on the rulemaking. But that said, the DOE NOPR may, as Chairman Bay mentioned earlier, could slow the progress on this particular NOPR a bit. So where does that take us, right? I think we track storage in terms of 4 key applications, and there are 4 potential ownership models as well. So that a nice little grid, if you can read the text. But the point here is that everything in blue, those opportunities exist today and can be monetized. Everything in green, which are 3 squares there, are opportunities that exist but are hard to monetize. And the orange, which is half of that grid right there, where opportunities may or may not exist, but there is so much uncertainty that investors are less likely to put their resources behind, right? So if we just sort of narrow down into market opportunities or IPP type of opportunities in power markets, most of them are either orange or at least one of them, ancillary services, does exist. Anyways, apparently I've run out of time, so I'm going to just leave on this slide, which is my last slide. The answer there being that we are at the early stages of that inflection point where we've seen very little growth in the past, from 2012 to 2016. Of course, 2016 and 2017 were aided by the Alistair Canyon deployments. But going forward, we do anticipate that the market would grow as much as 11 times between 2016 and 2022 to get to about 2.5 gigawatts of annual deployments. One thing to keep in mind is about half of that market is going to be made up of behind-the-meter storage deployments, which are, again, being driven by a completely different set of economic drivers and needs. I know we've run out of time, but I'm happy to take any questions. You can find me maybe outside at some point. Thank you.